Welcome to the third episode of the All About Beer podcast. I'm Em Sauter, better known as Pints and Panels.
And I'm Don Tse, better known as the Dawn of Beer.
Every 2 weeks, we talk with leading experts and take a deep dive into one topic about beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And if you're feeling generous or just love us, think about donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others.
This week on the show, we're going to talk about Kveik, the yeast strain that is changing the game when it comes to brewing. But Kveik's actually been around for a long time. So we'll be talking to head brewer Lily Schulz and Dr. Richard Priess.
Have you had a Kveik beer, Don? And I'm pronouncing it correctly, right? It's Kveik. I know I think we'll talk about it then, but I just want to make sure. I've heard it done a lot of different ways.
Yeah, there's an episode of The Simpsons where the alien says that to pronounce his name correctly, you would have to pull out your tongue. And I think that Kveik is sort of like that. But yes, I've had dozens of Kveik beers. I actually love them. And I think that a lot of people who don't like Kveik or say they don't like Kveik will be surprised to learn that they've probably unknowingly had some beers fermented by Kveik. Because there's lots of cool things happening with Kveik, and we'll obviously find out about them.
I'm really excited about this. So we'll introduce our guests and get into a conversation. But first, we're going to take a moment to hear from our sponsors of the show. And if you would like to help support the All About Beer podcast, reach out to podcast@allaboutbeer.com.
This show is brought to you by Athletic Brewing Company. Athletic Brewing Company's award-winning craft non-alcoholic beers are fit for all times: downtime, work time, game time, even gym time. Pick a time and grab an Athletic, because it's about time you could enjoy a great tasting brew anytime you want, even right now. Head to athleticbrewing.com and get some fresh brews delivered. New customers can even get 20% off with code AllaboutBeer20 and free shipping on 2 6-packs or more.
Hi, this is John Hall, the editor of All About Beer, inviting you to check out the Drink Beer, Think Beer podcast. It's available on all of the major platforms, and the weekly show features long-form conversations with brewers, growers, and personalities from the beer industry. New episodes release every Wednesday. Just search Drink Beer, Think Beer.
The first scientific paper ever published about Kveik was written by Escarpment Laboratories of Guelph, Ontario. Escarpment was co-founded by Richard Priess, a graduate of the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology at the University of Guelph. Richard is an active brewing scientist and longtime homebrewer. At Escarpment, Richard focuses on translating scientific research into new products and knowledge for brewers by bridging the gap between theory in the laboratory and practice in the brewery.
Our second guest is Ripe Proper's Shaw Brew Pub's head brewer, Lily Schulz, who grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, and started homebrewing with her father after she graduated from high school. After college in DC, she attempted the office job life, but found working as a bartender way more rewarding. After a few years working for a brewery in Maryland in many capacities that ultimately had her on the brew deck, Lily was hired as the lead brewer at Ripe Proper's Brew Pub. She works on a 5-barrel system, brewing many of her own recipes. She is also the co-leader for the DC Pink Boots chapter and received a scholarship from Pink Boots Society to go to the Haas Hop Academy last September in Yakima, Washington. All right, welcome, Richard and Lily. How are you guys doing today?
Doing well. How about you?
I'm well, thank you. How about you, Richard? Good?
Doing great. Always.
Lovely. I'm ready to talk about some yeast. How about you guys?
Always.
Always.
Cool. Perfect.
Richard always wants to talk about
Well,
this.
that's true. Well, I'm sure Lily wants to. I mean, it's part of the being a head brewer is yeast, vitality, whatnot. My first question, actually, I want to start about talking about it's Kveik, right? We were going to discuss how to pronounce it. It's Kveik. How does everyone say it?
I say Kveik like Viking is how I associate.
Oh, that's good. Smart.
It's I mean, even in Norway, you hear people say it a little differently. It's a softer V, but I'm not going to judge anyone. So it's like closer to like Kveik.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
You might hear people say Kveik. Like, I don't know. There's different ways of saying it.
Well, we're all on the same page, so that's
don't say Kveik and you're good.
Got it.
Okay.
Don, don't do it.
Okay. English isn't my first language, so please forgive me.
You're fine. So I guess my first question is for Lily is when was the first time you started using Kveik, and like what were your thoughts about it? Were you jazzed? Were you like, what the heck is this? What was your first experience with it?
Yeah, last summer was the first time I used it. I used the Horn and Dahl strain. Our yeast supplier is Jasper Yeast, so their sample of that. And you put it in a double IPA, and I was blown away. I love it. It's amazing to work with.
Why do you love it so much? Like what makes it so great? I mean, I've heard a lot of really great advantages. I'm not a brewer. I was actually telling Don before the show, I've only had a few beers, I believe, with Kveik. So my experience is quite limited. So I'm leaning on you all pretty hard to teach me here.
Well, especially Kveik yeast can be used in any beer style. Traditionally, it was used in the farmhouse Norwegian styles, but I really like using it with the hazy IPAs because it creates there's already the biotransformation between hops and yeast that exists whenever you do a hoppy beer. But when you combine it with such a fruity profile of yeast, and like fruity hop flavors, it makes a flavor explosion, like in my mind. There's a lot of potential there to create some really cool flavors. So that's why I really enjoy it.
That's really cool. I'm blown away by learning. The more and more I read about Kveik, maybe Richard, you can answer this. The more and more I learned about it, the more it was like, can this thing do anything wrong? Because the advantages that I saw was you use less, you can ferment it warmer, you can, it's a quicker fermentation. So, I mean, Richard, what are other advantages to this Kveik yeast? Because I don't see any disadvantages, but there has to be some, correct? I mean,
for sure. And there are some Kveik doubters that will be very quick to tell you the disadvantages. They exist. I'm very aware. That's okay. That's fine. But there are some really cool advantages. I mean, number one is that this is a whole family of yeast that was obscure. Basically, no one knew about it until about 6 or 7 years ago. And now brewers have access to basically this whole family of yeast, which opens up a lot of potential because they are unique in terms of what they can do, both just in terms of their handling in the brewery, but also in terms of the flavors they make. So that's really exciting. So in addition to some of the flavors, and in addition to some of the opportunities with pitch rates and temperatures, is one other thing that's really, I think, important, especially in the brewery side, is turnaround time too. So they can also ferment quite quickly with relatively minimal of the kind of conventional brewing yeast off flavors like diacetyl. So that's another potential advantage of Kveik. I'm going to be, the first one to say you can't use it in every single beer. You're never going to be able to make a fully authentic Czech Pils with Kveik. You do have to try to match the yeast to the beer you're making. And, from our side, some of the challenges we've seen has been helping people with just adapting. Maybe it's a hazy IPA recipe over to Kveik, because the yeast is just going to do slightly different things than maybe the London Ale 3 that everyone's usually using. So sometimes there's a little bit of training wheels needed to help people make that leap, or help, convert things over and get it working really, really well with Kveik. Like maybe it doesn't work perfectly the first time.
So Richard, you mentioned that it's kind of come onto the brewing scene here in the last 6 or 7 years, but Kveik is, hundreds of years old, right? So how is it that in 2022, or I guess 2015 was 7 years ago, we're still discovering these? Like, where does it come from? How did it come to be that this hundreds of year old yeast family all of a sudden bursts onto the scene?
Yeah, it's kind of a cool story. I mean, Kveik comes from traditional brewing in Western Norway. That's just their word for yeast. And it's been kept alive for a really, really long time, partially just because of how remote people are out there, and have relatively little influence from the outside world. They kind of had to fend for themselves for a really long time and be self-sufficient, and that meant that they were able to keep some of these more obscure traditions like farmhouse brewing alive. And that's essentially how we got Kveik, is people kept making traditional beer with the traditional yeast, and it didn't, die out because more convenient yeast and stuff like that became available. So, way back when, there would have been these kinds of things basically all over Europe. But with industrial brewing kind of taking over and being more convenient, a lot of that died out. But luckily, there's pockets in Europe, including in Western Norway, where traditional brewing practices survived, and in some places the yeast survived, and Kveik is a result of that. In terms of why we only found out about it more recently, I think it really took the internet and blogs and Facebook and things like that. So we had a beer writer, Lars Garshall, he's like the guy about farmhouse brewing. He's really the source of knowledge of a lot of this stuff. Started writing about it and sharing pictures, and I think that's really what captivated a lot of people to get interested in what's going on in Norway and get curious about these mythical super yeasts and start experimenting with them. And it really kind of just took off from there.
I guess I'm just kind of curious. Sorry.
I just want to say mythical super yeast is the best band name I've ever heard, or a beer name. So I think
Richard could use it for a strain, actually. Mythical super yeast. There you go, Richard.
I like the band idea. I'll take that.
I guess I think of brewers as obviously, and Lily can confirm this, of course. Brewers are always trying to improve their processes and everything. And as Em was saying, Kveik sounds so amazingly beneficial. High temperature, quick ferments and everything. Like, how is it that this was almost lost? Like, that it's been, I'm not articulating my question very well. Like, I find it so hard to believe that this unbelievably great brewing ingredient could be undiscovered. Well, not undiscovered, because we knew about it, or at least Norwegians knew about it. How is it that it's taken this long for brewers to discover it?
I think we had to reach a certain point in like willingness to experiment in craft beer as well. I think, especially when we look at the last few years, there's been an incredibly strong willingness by craft breweries to experiment with new things, and also a lot more competition. There's a lot more breweries, right? So everyone's competing to, bring something new to the table. So I think it did require that. And even on like the homebrew side, there was a much higher, I would say, as time has gone on, there's been more interest in experimenting and, trying all the crazy things. So I think that's part of why it took so long for Kveik to really take off. And again, it's like, this was relatively obscure. I would say that there probably weren't a lot of people going out and looking for, traditional beers in the middle of nowhere in Western Norway, right? It did take some people to actually talk about it and write about it in English, share pictures, and get people excited.
That's the most fascinating thing about beer, is that Don's right, it's 2022, and just now we're learning about all these different things that are really changing our way of brewing and brewing process for the better. I think that's really cool. And I mean, like, there's got to be so many undiscovered. It's like not Christopher Columbus. He's a terrible example. Think of a nicer explorer. Are there nice explorers? I don't think there are, actually. I'm sure there were. No, boo, get out of here. But like astronauts going to the moon, discovering new things. And there's so many things in the beer world, just in our own backyards, that are really, really fascinating. I guess my next question would be for Lily, which would be like, if it's so great, would Right Proper just be like, we're going to brew everything with Kveik, or is that just crazy talk?
Well, like Richard said, you can't brew a lager like with this.
But why not?
Well, lagers have very distinctive flavor profiles that I think are more driven from the yeast. You couldn't brew a saison with this. Like, there's some distinct styles of beer that this does not lean itself to. I think in the ale category, you definitely have a lot of potential, but it really just depends on the flavor profile you want to go with. I've done, like I said, hazy IPAs. We've also done a blonde ale. And I think we've also just done just another ale. I forget what, in a little bit.
Does the
yeah.
yeast create any kind of, because it's the same, it's sexy, so it's regular ale yeast, but does it create any kind of flavor? My limited scope of Kveik is I was at GABF with Stan Hieronymus, the beer writer, and I had a Kveik pale ale, and to me it tasted like, and I mean this in the best way possible. It was like a dirt. It was like minerally. It was
Earthy.
it was earthy. That's the nicer. Yeah, dirt sounds so sounds so rough. It was really earthy. And I don't know. And then now that I thought, oh, that's the yeast. Because in my head it was a style, and it's not a style. It's a strain of yeast, or it can make most styles for the most part, not all. But I don't know the point of my story here. But the thing is, I just find that it has so many uses. And what Don was talking about too, this is a great point, was the climate aspect of it. Lily, when you brew, do you find that your tanks get warmer because what's their fermentation temp for a hazy IPA? And you're like, how long are you from, putting in the fermenter to finish? How long is in there, and what's your ferm temp?
Yeah, so like a normal ale strain, you'd ferment at like 68, 70 degrees. With Kveik yeast, I ferment at 85 to 100 degrees. Usually I like the 90-degree range most. It puts off, the higher temperatures you ferment it at, it puts off a lot more fruity esters. So more like with the Hornindal strain, more tropical forward fruitiness. But with the Arsit strain, I think it's more like pear, and then the Voss strain is more like citrus, tangerine. And those are the ones I've worked with. But all of them put off different fruity esters that really come out more presently when it's at a higher temperature. Most people ferment at 90 to 100 degrees. But if you ferment lower at like a traditional ale temperature, that they'll just be more muted. Not that they'll go away, but the esters will just, they're not as pronounced. So for the beer styles I'm wanting, and I want that flavor profile, that's why I'm fermenting so hot. And that's how it's traditionally done too.
Yeah, and how long is it in the tank for?
Turnaround time is probably less than a week. It's really, really quick. From pitching, I'm dry hopping within a week, like 5 days, and then crashing a few days later. Yeah.
I guess my next question is, have you noticed customers be like, I can taste the Kveik? Or is it just they don't know? Or, I mean, I don't, to be honest, I don't know if you put two ales in, like if there was one with a traditional like London 3 versus Kveik, I don't know if I'd be able to tell the difference. Do customers go, oh, I can taste this? Because if they can't, then would you make all of these beers? Because it just seems like there's so much money to be made, right? Like you're doing it in half the time. You're using less yeast,
less glycol.
Less glycol, and it just seems like a better all around. And if customers can't tell, and if they like it more because they're looking for that fruit, at least in the lower bitterness, it seems like kind of a home run, and really exciting.
Yeah, I don't know so much from the customer side. I'm not customer facing working in the brewery, but talking to our staff, they love it. So, and they're the people who interact with our customers. So if anything that our staff is jazzed about, then I feel like they're only going to sell it better, and they're going to communicate better to our customers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I definitely think they can tell when I have made an IPA without it and an IPA with it, and they personally prefer the Kveik, and so do I. It's so flavorful, and it does maintain such strong haze stability. And so for that style, it works really well. Same with the blonde ale. It's super fruity and fun with that.
Lily, have you tried to reproduce an existing recipe by swapping out the yeast and trying to reproduce the recipe for purely economic reasons, like that you could ferment it quicker, but you're You're actually not trying to change the flavor?
No, not so. What I do, I'm the lead brewer at the brew pub, so I don't really make consistent styles of beer. Everything I do is more or less a one-off. So that's not really my focus area. I would be curious to see from a production standpoint what happens. We're actually doing this at our other facility, the production facility. We make an IPA called Beer Noir, and we are changing the yeast in this one to the Kveik strain. So I can report back on that and see what
Okay,
our flavor profile is. Yeah, they're brewing it today actually. So what time?
Richard, do you maybe have some experience with some of your clients as to, switching a non-Kveik strain for a Kveik strain? I keep saying Kveik, switching out for a Kveik strain and having success with that?
Yeah, there are a few larger production breweries that are using Kveik or even smaller breweries that are using Kveik just for those operational advantages. So that's kind of one category of things, is just trying to swap out a different strain using a Kveik. And the cool thing is there's so many different Kveik strains that it's often possible to find something that's pretty close or complements that beer, whatever it is, its flavor profile. So that is a possibility. The other cool thing that we've seen is there's a lot of breweries that have created new brands just through leveraging what Kveik can do, whether that's in terms of the flavor or whether that's in terms of the turnaround time. So people that are creating new brands where maybe they can price it in a way that makes it more competitive. Or market it in a way, right? This is a new ingredient. It's something that can get the comparatively new ingredient, something that can get the consumers excited. So we see a lot of that too, of breweries building brands around the yeast.
Cool.
I want to talk about that. But first, we're going to take a short commercial break to hear a word from our sponsor.
This show is brought to you by Athletic Brewing Company. Athletic Brewing Company's award-winning craft non-alcoholic beers are fit for all times: downtime, work time, game time, even gym time. Pick a time and grab an Athletic, because it's about time you could enjoy a great tasting brew anytime you want, even right now. Head to athleticbrewing.com and get some fresh brews delivered. New customers can even get 20% off with code ALLABOUTBEER20 and free shipping on 2 6-packs or more.
Hi, this is John Hall, the editor of All About Beer, inviting you to check out the Drink Beer, Think Beer podcast. It's available on all of the major platforms, and the weekly show features long-form conversations with brewers, growers, and personalities from the beer industry. New episodes release every Wednesday. Just search Drink Beer, Think Beer.
All right, and we're back. So I want to talk a little bit about, I didn't know there were different strains. I just thought there was one Kveik strain that everyone used, came from that crazy looking ring thing that I've seen on the internet. Richard, can you talk a little bit about, I know Lily mentioned it briefly, but a little bit about the different strains and like what flavors they put out?
Yeah, that's something really important to clarify. Is it's not just one strain of yeast, it's actually a whole family. So just like we have, a bunch of different types of English yeasts and a bunch of different types of Belgian yeast, it's the exact same thing with Kveik. It's a whole family. So you don't just have one, right? You have a bunch of different strains that have different characteristics. So just as I know Lily talked a bit about Voss and Arsit and Hornindal, and I would agree with those descriptions across the board. There's other ones too. We have more than 50 original cultures in our bank. And, even in one Kveik, you might have 12 or 15 different strains of yeast in there. So there's a huge amount of diversity, and we found some interesting ones. One of our favorites is called Lairdal, and it's a strain that ferments a lot like the London 3 that everyone's using for the hazies, but it has a lot more of that really nice pineapple ester. So that's become really popular for those kinds of beers. We have another one that, we call it crispy because it's clean. But that's one that can be used for cleaner beers, even at slightly higher temperatures. So if you're making something that's like a cream ale or a Kolsch or a light lager, it's great for that kind of application because it's clean. And maybe you don't want like raging pineapple esters all the time.
Again,
Cool.
Raging Pineapple Esters is a great name for a band. Just gonna small follow-up for Lily. When you use these yeasts, do you find you're hopping less because you're getting a lot of flavor from the yeast?
Not necessarily. I think my dry hop rates I'm actually starting to increase them a little bit more, just because that's separately experimenting with that. But no, I think I don't think that it really changes too much in that capacity.
Okay.
Is there potential there though? I do think that that's kind of an interesting, or Richard, maybe are you aware of anybody who said, oh, I'm saving money on hops now?
I mean, we've tried to sell brewers on the idea of reducing their hop usage through yeast, but even with the yeasts that enhance hop aroma, I think they just want more and more. So they'll use the same amount of hops and just get the yeast to do a little bit more heavy lifting. But yeah, you can get more impact by choosing the right yeast. And there are some Kveiks that are really, really complement hop aromas really well, like Hornindal and Ebegarden.
Okay, cool. Everybody wants their hops.
Yeah, it's hard to convince brewers just to put less hops in the beer for some reason.
So can we talk about, I know, Richard, you do a lot of hybridization and other lab techniques. Like, what's the future look like? Like you say, we've only been playing with these yeasts for 6 or 7 years. So what does Kveik look like 10 years from now?
There's kind of two sides to it. So like number one is because these are so recently discovered and applied in new contexts, we're still learning a lot. Like we're still learning how to handle these yeasts and how to make them behave, sort of, to put it that way. There's still been a lot to learn, and I think that's going to help us to work with them a lot better just by doing the research and understanding what flavors do we get at what temperatures, pitch rates, all of that important nitty-gritty stuff. But then on the other side, I think there's a lot of potential to work with Kveik as a platform to develop new brewing yeasts. So there's lots of different ways that can be approached. But one example might be hybridizing a Kveik with a conventional yeast to get something that's somewhere in between. Because something we have learned is that there are a lot of Kveik doubters out there, and maybe they don't like the specific flavor of a specific strain. But I think that everyone would want to be able to ferment warmer, faster, turn around their beers, with more efficiency. So I see a lot of potential for example, breeding Kveik with some of the conventional ale strains and producing something that meets in the middle and offers some of those advantages, but isn't, too far off what people are, typically using for their beers. There's also, I think, because there's a lot of interesting outliers within all of these different Kveik strains, there's some opportunity for us to really expand what brewing yeast is capable of, in terms of temperature or in terms of flavors. So, working with those strains, whether that's through, understanding the genetics and being able to engineer that into other strains in the future, or something more natural like crossbreeding. So a lot of potential to create next generation yeasts and help brewers hit their targets.
Cool.
I have a question. Does it have to be Lily, when you're using it, does Kveik have to be, is it more temperamental? Do you have to facilitate your brew house in a different way, or is it easier to use? How is it compared to, let's say, your normal ale yeast in terms of process?
I think it's the same, really, depending on what style of beer you're brewing and how you have to adapt, like your mash temperature or whatever for that. It seems pretty resilient, and I mean, it's stood the test of time to this point for a reason. So it's definitely, there isn't like a ton of changes I need to be making.
Is there a style you'd want to use it with that you haven't done, because since you do a lot of one-offs, what are you like itching to do with it if you could do anything?
Oh, I'd be curious to see how it plays with more like roasted malts, going darker with it, just to like, I don't know, maybe like a tropical stout would be just an interesting concept.
Yes.
But I don't know how well that would sell. So it could be not great, but it could be fun.
Don, have you ever had a dark Kveik stout? Have you ever had?
No, I'm trying to think if I don't think I have, and I'm all excited for this.
You can make a pretty good stout with Hornindal. I wouldn't go as hot on the fermentation temp just to keep the esters in check. But if you ferment around like 75 Fahrenheit, you can get some really nice results. That's just a hint.
Ooh.
There you go.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll take that.
This is awesome. Now, how am I going to get to taste this beer, though? I got to figure that out. Okay.
You're gonna have to come to. We'll go to DC and we'll visit.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good.
All right. Let's see. What other questions do we have to ask? Oh my gosh, I'm blanking. This is so embarrassing. I apologize. Go ahead, Don.
No, I was just gonna, Richard, do you think that there's any, as we're seeing, it's 2022, malt prices are up, hop prices are up, there's logistics issues. Do you see, are there environmental benefits to using Kveik?
Absolutely. Like in a lot of ways, like number one is that you can get good fermentation results at higher temperatures than you normally would. So the burden on a glycol system would be a lot less if it has to be kept at, 90 Fahrenheit versus 68, right? So that's an obvious benefit. It also tends to last longer. Maybe that's not great for us yeast labs, but it tends to last longer if it's stored in between batches as well. Whereas some yeast strains, if you don't use it within a few days, it's all dead. So there's some benefits there. But really, yeah, reducing those cooling costs and also increasing that throughput. So you're able to get more out of the same amount of equipment. I think in both cases has a lot of potential environmental benefits.
Okay, then, so flip side, maybe I'll ask Lily, like, what are the limitations of the yeast?
I actually don't know.
Oh.
I haven't had any bad things here, so maybe could you ask Richard? We just mentioned it earlier.
Richard?
I mean, I think that Kveik does, even, I know that there's a lot of different strains, but it does have some distinctive flavors. So, there are some, unfortunately, I've heard some people start calling it like Kveik twang or like the Kveik taste. And it's been really, really hard to get those people to define what the heck they're talking about. But there are certainly some flavors that people don't like. That might come down to handling as well, which is, again, why I think it's important to make sure that we're also working on how do we actually use these yeasts the best and get the best out of them, because maybe there's some gaps there. But there are some limitations. Like one is that it drops the pH more than the average yeast does. So if unless you're really watching the water chemistry in your mashing, sometimes you can end up with a beer that tastes a little bit more acidic or a little bit more tart or thin than a beer with English ale yeast might, just as an example. All of that can be adjusted, but that's sort of speaking to the challenge of it doesn't always work perfectly if you just plug it into your standard recipe. Sometimes you need to make some adjustments and work with it. So that would be one that I would cite is, that some of those differences just in the fermentation, like in the pH drop, create some limits to what can be done with it.
I've heard, I'm not a brewer, but I've heard as well that Kveik during the propagation phase really sucks up a lot of nitrogen and other nutrients. So do brewers have to adjust for that? And does that actually cost more money that would negate some of the economic benefits of using Kveik strains?
It doesn't really cost more money. You do have to watch the nutrition. It does like having a lot of nitrogen, a lot of oxygen, but really that just comes down to malt selection. If you're using any malt from North America, you're probably fine in terms of nutrients already. If you're using like a super light European Pilsner malt, then maybe you want to put in some additional nutrition in there. And, in general, a little bit of added yeast nutrients is always a good idea just to kind of hedge your bets against what's in the malt. But I wouldn't say that it would cost any more to work with Kveik than it would any other yeast.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Any other questions, Don? I'm fascinated because I really think that weren't you mentioning a local brewery in your town that was doing lagers 10 days and no one could tell the difference?
Yeah, two stories. Actually 3 stories. And I'm not going to say the name of the brewery, but I'm aware of a brewery that first of all, changed all of their yeasts, all of their strains to Kveik strains. And consumers didn't seem to notice. So there does seem to be a way to get rid of that Kveik twang that Richard was talking about. And this same brewery, they make a lager, and it used to take 42 days from mash in to packaging, using a traditional lager strain, and the long lagering process that takes. And they switched to a clean Kveik strain, and they can now can 10 days after mash in, which I just think is, that's 1/4 of the time. And I just think the economics of that is amazing. And then, they can actually track that their energy use is lower because of the high fermentation temperatures. And again, they're using Kveik strains across the board now. And so they're consistently saving energy costs, which I think is fascinating.
That's really cool. Is it still a lager then? Is it still, I guess as a little bit more of I'm still in the traditionalist phase, I guess, of what my brewing career is. Like, I want to make true to styles. Like, I still experiment, but what makes that a lager then? Is it a bottom fermenting Kveik strain, or is it not?
Richard, you might be able to speak to this a bit. I do think that they continue to market it as a lager, even though they're using a Kveik strain, which I believe all Kveik strains are technically Saxe, so they would all be technically ale strains. But I was reading actually just today about some laboratories, and maybe Richard, maybe yours is one of them, doing some genetic sequencing of various yeast strains, not just Kveik, and discovering that, in fact, a lot of the yeasts that we quote unquote know to be lagers or ales actually aren't, and it's really muddying the waters. And I know this is a little bit off topic from our Kveik topic, but Richard, are you aware of any of that, or can speak to that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in beer we've lived in a pretty binary world, but I think in reality, when you dig into the genetics of the yeast and what they're being used for, it's a lot less binary than one would think. So, there's pretty famous lagers that are made with Sax cerevisiae. There's pretty famous ales that are made with Pastorianus lager yeast. So, the lines are kind of blurry. I'll be the first to kind of fight for lager yeast. I think that they're really special and they do have a unique flavor profile. And that's why, making a super traditional lager style with Kveik is hard. It's not impossible. It sounds like the folks you were talking to have figured it out. But it's tricky because, lager yeast, I think, does have some benefits. That being said, if the choice is between turning out a beer in 42 days versus 10 days, and it's, not an uber traditional, German Helles or something like that, then why not? Why not turn it around faster? And I think when we're talking about, yeasts for lager styles, typically what we really mean is it clean or not, right? Does it let the other ingredients shine through? Is it producing a ton of esters? Is it producing other, flavors that kind of muddy the waters? And in the case of Kveik, because there's so many different strains out there and so much genetic diversity, we've been able to find strains that do produce objectively clean results and, consequently can produce those very, very clean beers that I think in some cases can pass for lagers. It really depends. It's this is very open for debate as well. But, our experience, even just looking at outside of Kveik, is that, you don't have to use a lager yeast to make a lager. You don't have to use an ale yeast to make an ale, right? These things can be a little bit more fluid than one might see in the textbooks.
So, Lily, has Richard convinced you, or are you still skeptical?
No, it's not that I needed. I mean, yes, I'm convinced. I think you can experiment with all of it. And again, it really just depends how it's presenting. It doesn't really matter what's all inside of it necessarily. But yeah, it is fascinating to think about more of the, like, if you think about like the guidelines for, winning medals or whatever, it's like, does that really matter? Like, sorry, my words are a little jumbled.
No, but yeah, I do take your point. Like I think it's kind of an interesting time to be a brewer. You might disagree with me, Lily, but I think there's so many, beer is thousands, if not tens of thousands of years old. And I love the fact that we're still asking questions, even at this basic level, like ale versus lager. That's still, we still have opinions on it. It's not settled, which I think is pretty cool.
Absolutely. That's why I fell in love with it. There's so much to learn.
So, and there's a lot of, something I say a lot is there's a lot of right answers in beer. So you can brew an ale, our first podcast was not to talk about our podcast, but we talked about the cold IPA, and people get very mad that it's brewed with lager yeast, but it's called an ale. But then I would argue that a Baltic Porter is made with lager yeast, or a tropical stout can be made with lager yeast, warm fermented lager yeast. So there's more esterification. And so there is a little bit of a muddy water, but at the same time, is it delicious? Did it taste good? I guess I'm one of those like celebratory people that I don't know. I care. It's just, and I want to learn more, especially with this Kveik, because it just seems like it's going to change everything in terms of, especially beers that are really popular, like hazies, especially where I live in New England. So that's the thing. I also remember when I said I didn't have one, I've 100% had one. I've got to had one living in New England. Don, I probably, yeah. Do that's, I guess, is labeling it Kveik a selling point? I'm not sure, since like, not because this isn't really a customer discussion, but I've probably had one and I didn't even know it. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know.
Lily, when you're using a Kveik strain, do you always label the beer as such?
I think so. I do. When I'm labeling, I say like a hazy Kveik IPA, just because I also am when I go to a place, I want to know what all the things are, but I'm also a nerd. So
I'm also, you're among nerds here.
Yeah.
But yeah. I think earlier, Lily, you mentioned that at the production brewery, they were experimenting with changing a yeast over. Do you think that they will keep the name or disclose that it's the yeast change, or is it too early to know?
I think it's a little too early to know, but I don't think they will like advertise it necessarily. Right. Production breweries don't typically like to advertise when they're making a big change to a recipe, because consistency of brands is key. So
right.
Yeah, I doubt we'll advertise it, but it is cool to know that. But people do it all the time. Like, again, you're working with organic ingredients that we were talking about the grain harvest is changed this year. The hops were bad last year, or not bad, but changed. Everything is so fluid that you're always adapting your recipes. That's not new. But I feel like sometimes the customer education point is like they think change is bad. So if you tell them that it's different, then they may or may not think that is a good thing. So,
and what prompted at the production brewery, what prompted the decision to try and switch out these? Like, was it purely economics, or are they trying to enhance the fruity flavors?
I think it was because I've made like 5 hazy IPAs with this different varieties of this yeast, Kveik, and the head brewer over there has liked them and wanting to try to do their own over there, and it's been successful here, so it's easier to scale up now.
Yeah, cool. The future.
It is. I think, yeah, it really is. It's exciting, and I'm excited to see what we learn next, not just about Kveik, but about other yeast strains. Because there's beer all over the world that I've never had, or we've never had, that will probably make it to the craft scene. It's just fun how we're always relearning things and learning things in general. It's exciting. It makes beer fun.
Yeah. And I think yeast is, everybody's been excited about hops the last couple decades, and I think yeast is a new frontier where I think a lot of consumers, a lot of brewers would advertise the fact that they were using traditional strains. Like, we made our Belgian triple and we fermented it with Westmalle yeast or whatever. People were proud of using these historic strains of yeast, and I think now there's a desire to, as Richard was saying, as competition's gotten tighter and people need a marketing angle, I think we're going to see more and more adoption of novel yeasts, I think. I don't know. Richard, Lily, thoughts on that?
I can go ahead if you want.
Sure.
Yeah, like I think that we are entering into a phase, at least in craft beer, where a lot of the exciting innovation is in yeast, not to discount, the stuff in the other ingredients, but even on the hop side, it's like, well, where do we go from Sabro? Like, we made hops taste like coconut, we won, right? I don't know where we go from there. Whereas with yeast, there's, there has been a lot of adherence to tradition for so long that a lot of obvious development and innovation has kind of just been like waiting to happen. And now that's starting to happen. Like, you're seeing these bioengineered yeasts, especially in the US, just, hitting the market and getting a lot of uptake way faster than anyone thought. Like, whether it's, the thiol enhanced yeasts or acid producing, like, there's a lot of cool stuff coming out. And then even just with our conventional strains, there's a lot of room for improvement, whether that's just, breeding them to make new combinations, kind of like what's been done with hops for so long, or just, finding new ways to use the strain in new context, which is really the story of Kveik, right? Having a yeast from a traditional farmhouse beer that can find a lot of new homes. And, there's a lot of other farmhouse yeasts that are a lot more obscure than Kveik that you'll probably see coming out sooner than later as well, right? So there's a lot of potential there, even just with stuff that's being discovered still all around the world. And that's not even to mention any of the stuff that's out there in nature and might have some interesting traits that we can find ways to leverage in beer.
Yeah. Lily?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think yeast is the next, I hope selfishly that yeast is the next like product of innovation in beer, because it's the thing that gives me the most joy, and like why I love my job is because I have a wild room and a clean room, so I get to experiment with whatever yeast I want, and it's so fun, and I just want everyone to know how fun that flavor profile comes from. And there's a lot of breweries out there that have made their money on like fully focused on hops for a while, and I am so tired of having another version of an IPA with just the same malt bill but different hops. As a consumer, I'm tired of that, but I get stoked when there's something new with like a saison that has like a Brett strain in it, or a dry hop saison, or I don't know, just fun sours and anything that you can imagine. And I'm excited to see how the Kveik yeast plays into that as well.
Yeah,
so fun.
It's exciting.
The future is fermentation.
I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for coming on the All About Beer podcast today. We really appreciate your knowledge, and I'm excited to see the future of Kveik.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers.
So what did you think about that, Em?
So I thought that maybe I hadn't had a lot of Kveik beers, but I think now I've had a lot of them, which is crazy.
I think you probably have. I think that Kveik is such a new thing. And as Richard kind of taught us, like we're just at the beginning of the learning curve to figure out what we can do with this stuff. I think that's super interesting that there's so much still to learn.
It's exciting. I'm really excited to see what the future is with Kveik, because it sounds really great. I love hazies. I live in New England, so I'm excited to try more hazies made with it. I'm excited to try some lagers made with it. It's an exciting development in yeast, and yeah, the future is fermentation.
And I also like that it has, there's some environmental aspects to it that people can save, use less energy when brewing, use less time. So, I think we have to be conscious of these things as the craft beer industry continues to grow. I think we need to think about these questions.
It's exciting. I'm excited.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's our show for the day. Visit us at allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer.
And if you want to throw us a couple bucks, please visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer, and you can support this show and others.
If you have any questions for the experts, email podcast@allaboutbeer.com. That's also the email for feedback, suggestions, or to inquire about supporting the show through advertising. Well, speaking of advertising, here's a short word from our sponsors.
This show is brought to you by Athletic Brewing Company. Athletic Brewing Company's award-winning craft non-alcoholic beers are fit for all times: downtime, work time, game time, even gym time. Pick a time and grab an Athletic, because it's about time you could enjoy a great tasting brew anytime you want, even right now. Head to athleticbrewing.com and get some fresh brews delivered. New customers can even get 20% off with code AllaboutBeer20 and free shipping on 2 6-packs or more.
Hi, this is John Hall, the editor of All About Beer, inviting you to check out the Drink Beer, Think Beer podcast. It's available on all of the major platforms, and the weekly show features long-form conversations with brewers, growers, and personalities from the beer industry. New episodes release every Wednesday. Just search Drink Beer, Think Beer.
Before we go, Don, how do I get in contact with you if I want to talk to you about beer?
I am Don at thedonofbeer.com is my email. And then on all socials, I'm at the Don of Beer.
Pints and Panels is pintsandpanels.com is my website. Also on all social media channels at Pints and Panels. This show is produced by All About Beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com for articles, notes on the show, and others, and connect via the newsletter and social media. Cheers.
Cheers.